Chapter 22. 3 Signs. West crashed onto his arse, one of his steels skittering out of his hands and across the cobbles. "That's the touch!" shouted Marshal Varus. "A definite touch! Well fought, Giselle, well fought!" West was starting to tire of losing. He was stronger than Giselle and taller, with a better reach, but the cocky little bastard was quick, damn quick, and getting quicker. He knew all of West's tricks now, more or less, and if he kept improving at this rate, he'd soon be beating him every time. Giselle knew it too. He had a smile of infuriating smugness on his face as he offered his hand to West and helped him up from the ground. "We're getting somewhere now." Varus slapped his stick against his leg in delight. "We may even have ourselves a champion, eh, Major?" "Very likely, sir," said West, rubbing at his elbow, bruised and throbbing from his fall. He looked sidelong at Giselle, basking in the warmth of the Marshal's praise. "But we must not grow complacent." "No, sir," said Giselle emphatically. "No, indeed," said Varus. "Major West is a capable fencer, of course, and you are privileged to have him as a partner, but, well," and he grinned at West, "fencing is a young man's game, eh, Major?" "Of course it is, sir," muttered West. "A young man's game." "Bremer Dan Gorst, I expect, will be a different sort of opponent, as will the others at this year's contest. Less of the veteran's cunning, perhaps, but more of the vigor of youth, eh, West?" West, at 30, was still feeling somewhat vigorous, but there was no purpose in arguing. He knew he'd never been the most gifted swordsman in the world. "We have made great progress this past month, great progress. You have a chance, if you can maintain your focus. A definite chance. Well done. I will see you both tomorrow." And the old Marshal strutted from the sunny courtyard. West walked over to his fumbled steel lying on the cobbles by the wall. His side was still aching from the fall, and he had to bend awkwardly to get it. "I have to be going myself," he grunted as he straightened up, trying to hide his discomfort as best he could. "Important business?" "Marshal Burr has asked to see me." "Is it to be war, then?" "Perhaps. I don't know." West looked Giselle up and down. He was avoiding West's eye for some reason. "And you? What have you got in mind for today?" Giselle fiddled with his steels. Nothing planned. Not really." He glanced up furtively. For such a good card player, the man was a useless liar. West felt a niggling of worry. "Ardy wouldn't be involved in your lack of plans, would she?" The niggling became a cold throbbing. "Well, maybe," snapped Giselle. "Well, yes." West stepped right up to the younger man. "Giselle?" he heard himself saying slowly through gritted teeth. "I hope you're not planning to fuck my sister." "Now look here." The throbbing boiled over. West's hands gripped hold of Giselle by his shoulders. "No, you look," he snarled. "I'll not have her trifled with, you understand? She's been hurt before, and I'll not see her hurt anymore. Not by you, not by anyone. I won't stand for it. She's not one of your games, you hear me?" "All right," said Giselle, face suddenly pale. "All right, I've no designs on her. We're just friends is all. I like her. She doesn't know anyone here, and you can trust me. There's no harm in it." "Get off me!" West realized he was squeezing Giselle's arms with all his strength. How had that happened? He'd only meant to have a quiet word, and now he'd gone way too far. Hurt before. Damn it. He should never have said that. He let go suddenly, drew back, swallowing his fury. "I don't want you seeing her anymore. Do you hear me? Now hold on, West. Who are you to—" West's anger began to pulse again. "Giselle," he growled, "I'm your friend, so I'm asking you." He stepped forward again, closer than ever. "And I'm her brother, so I'm warning you. Stay away. No good can come of it. Giselle shrank back against the wall. All right. She's your sister. West turned and stalked towards the archway, rubbing the back of his neck, his head thumping. Lord Marshal Burr was sitting and staring out of the window when West arrived at his offices. A big, grim, beefy man with a thick brown beard and a simple uniform. West wondered how bad the news would be. If the Marshal's face was anything to go by, it was very bad indeed. "Major West," he said, glaring up from under his heavy brows. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, sir." West noticed 3 roughly made wooden boxes on a table by the wall. Burr saw him looking at them. "Gifts," he said sourly, "from our friend in the north, Bethod." "Gifts? For the king, it seems." The Marshal scowled and sucked at his teeth. "Why don't you have a look at what he sent us, Major?" West walked over to the table, reached out and cautiously opened the lid of one of the boxes. An unpleasant smell flowed out like well-rotted meat, but there was nothing inside but some brown dirt. He opened the next box. The smell was worse. More brown dirt caked around the inside, and some hair, some strands of yellow hair. West swallowed, looked up at the frowning Lord Marshal. "Is that all, sir?" Burr snorted. "If only. The rest we had to bury." "Bury?" The Marshal picked up a sheet of paper from his desk. "Captain Silber, Captain Hoss, Colonel Arenhorn. Those names mean anything to you?" West felt sick. That smell. It reminded him of Gurkel somehow, of the battlefield. "Colonel Arenhorn, I know," he mumbled, staring at the 3 boxes. "By reputation. He's commander of the garrison at Dunbrek." "Was," corrected Burr. "And the other 2 commanded small outposts nearby on the frontier." "The frontier?" mumbled West, but he already guessed what was coming. "Their heads, Major. The Northmen sent us their heads." West swallowed, looking at the yellow hairs stuck to the inside of the box. 3 signs, they said, when it was time." Burr got up from his chair and stood looking out of the window. "The outposts were nothing. Wooden buildings mostly, a palisade wall, ditches and so on, lightly manned. Little strategic importance. Dunbrek is another matter." "It commands the fords on the Whiteflow," said West numbly. "The best way out of England." "Or in. A vital point. Considerable time and resources were spent on the defences there. The very latest designs were used, our finest architects. A garrison of 300 men, with stores of weapons and food to stand a year of siege. It was considered impregnable, the linchpin of our plans for the defence of the frontier." Burr frowned, deep grooves appearing across the bridge of his nose. "Gone." West's head had started hurting again. "When, sir?" "When is the question. It must have been at least 2 weeks ago for these gifts to have reached us." "I am being called defeatist," said Burr sourly. "But I guess that the Northmen are loose, and that by now they have overrun half of northern England. A mining community or 2, several penal colonies, nothing so far of major importance, no towns to speak of. But they are coming west, and fast, you may be sure of that. You don't send heads to your enemy, then wait politely for a reply." "What is being done?" "Precious little. England is in uproar, of course. Lord Governor Meade is raising every man determined to march out and beat Bethod on his own, the idiot. Varying reports place the Northmen anywhere and everywhere, with 1,000 men or 100,000. The ports are choked with civilians desperate to escape. Rumours are rife of spies and murderers loose in the country, and mobs seek out citizens with northern blood and beat them, rob them, or worse. Put simply, it is chaos. Meanwhile, we sit here on our fat arses waiting. But weren't we warned? Didn't we know? Of course! Burr threw his broad hand up in the air. But no one took it very seriously, would you believe? Damned painted savage stabs himself on the floor of the open council, challenges us before the king, and nothing is done. Government by committee, everyone pulling their own way. You can only react, never prepare. The marshal coughed and burped, spat on the floor.
Damn it. Damn indigestion.
He sat back in his chair, rubbing his stomach unhappily. West hardly knew what to say.
How do we proceed?
He mumbled.
We've been ordered north immediately, meaning as soon as anyone can be bothered to supply me with men and arms. The king, meaning that drunkard Hoff, has commanded me to bring these Northmen to heel. 12 regiments of the king's own, 7 of foot and 5 of horse, to be fleshed out with levies from the aristocracy and whatever the Anglanders haven't squandered before we get there.
West shifted uncomfortably in his chair.
That should be an overwhelming force.
Grunted the marshal.
It better be. It's everything we have, more or less. And that worries me.
West frowned.
The Gosker, Major. We cannot fight the Gurkish and the Northmen both at once.
But surely, sir, the Gurkish, they wouldn't risk another war so soon. I thought it was all idle talk.
I hope so. I hope so.
Burr pushed some papers absently around his desk.
But this new emperor, Uthman, is not what we were expecting. He was the youngest son, but when he heard of his father's death, he had all his brothers strangled. Strangled them himself, some say. Uthman ul-Dosht, they are calling him. Uthman the Merciless. He has already declared his intention to recapture Dagoska. Empty talk, perhaps, perhaps not.
Burr pursed his lips.
He might even now be learning of our troubles in England, might even now be preparing to take advantage of our weakness. We must be done quickly with these Northmen, very quickly. 12 regiments and levies from the noblemen, and from that point of view it could not be a worse time.
Sir?
This business with the Mercers, a bad business. Some of the big noblemen got stung. Brock, Isher, Barazin, and others. Now they're dragging their feet with the levies. Who knows what they'll send us, or when? Bunch of half-starved, unarmed beggars, probably. An excuse to clean the scrapings from their land. A useless crowd of extra mouths to feed and clothe and arm, and we're desperately short of good officers.
I have some good men in my battalion.
Burr twitched impatiently. Good men, yes. Honest men, enthusiastic men, but not experienced. Most of those who fought in the south did not enjoy it. They have left the army and have no intention of returning. Have you seen how young the officers are these days? We're a damn finishing school. And now His Highness the Prince has expressed his interest in a command. He doesn't even know which end of a sword to hold, but he is set on glory, and I cannot refuse him.
Prince Reynold?
If only! Shouted Burr. Reynold might actually be of some use. It's Ladislas I'm talking of, commanding a division, a man who spends 1,000 marks a month on clothes. His lack of discipline is notorious. I've heard it said that he's forced himself on more than one servant in the palace, but that the Arch-Lector was able to silence the girls.
Surely not, said West, although he had actually heard such a rumour himself.
The heir to the throne in harm's way when the king is in poor health? A ludicrous notion.
Burr got up, burping and wincing.
Damn his stomach!
He stalked over to the window and frowned out across the Agriont.
They think it will be easily settled, he said quietly. The closed council. A little jaunt in England, done with before the first snow falls. in spite of this shock with Dunbrek. They never learn. They said the same about our war with the Gurkish, and that nearly finished us. These Northmen are not the primitives they think. I fought with northern mercenaries in Starikland. Hard men used to hard lives, raised on warfare, fearless and stubborn, expert at fighting in the hills, in the forests, in the cold. They do not follow our rules or even understand them. They will bring a violence and a savagery to the battlefield that would make a Gurkish blush. Burr turned away from the window, back to West. You were born in Angland, weren't you, Major? Yes, sir, in the south, near Ostenholm. My family's farm was there before my father died. He trailed off. You were raised there? Yes. You know the land, then? West frowned. In that region, sir, but I've not been back for... Do you know these Northmen? Some. There are still many living in Angland. You speak their tongue? Yes, a little, but they speak many. Good. I'm putting together a staff. Good men I can rely on to carry out my orders and to see to it that this army of ours does not fall apart before it even comes into contact with the enemy. Of course, sir. West racked his brains. Captain Lothar is a capable and intelligent officer. Lieutenant Jellenholm... Bah! Shouted Burr, waving his hand in frustration. I know Lothar. The boy's a cretin. Just the sort of bright-eyed child that I was talking about. It's you I need, West. Me? Yes, you. Marshal Varuz, the Union's most famous soldier, no less, has given you a glowing report. He says you are a most committed, tenacious, and hard-working officer, the very qualities I need. As a lieutenant, you fought in Gurkel under Colonel Glokta, did you not? West swallowed. Well, yes. And it is well known you were first through the breach at Ulriok. Well, among the first, I was... You have led men in the field, and your personal courage is beyond question. There is no need to be modest, Major. You are the man for me. Burr sat back, a smile on his face, confident he had made his point. He burped again, holding up his hand. My apologies. Damn indigestion. Sir, may I be blunt? I am no courtier, West. You must always be blunt with me. I demand it. An appointment on a Lord Marshal's staff, sir. You must understand, I am a gentleman's son, a commoner. As commander of a battalion, I already have difficulty gaining the respect of the junior officers. The men I would have to give orders to if I were on your staff, sir, senior men with good blood. He paused, exasperated. The Marshal gazed blankly at him. They will not permit it. Burr's eyebrows drew together. Permit it? Their pride will not allow it, sir. Damn their pride. Burr leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on West's face. Now listen to me, and listen carefully. Times are changing. I don't need men with good blood. I need men who can plan and organize, give orders, and follow them. There will be no room in my army for those who cannot do as they are told. I don't care how noble they are. As a member of my staff, you represent me, and I will not be slighted or ignored. He burped suddenly and smashed the table with his fist. I will see to it, he roared. Times are changing. They may not smell it yet, but they soon will. West stared dumbly back. In any case, and Burr waved a dismissive hand, I am not consulting with you, I am informing you. This is your new assignment. Your king needs you, your country needs you, and that is all. You have 5 days to hand over command of your battalion. And the Lord Marshal turned back to his papers. Yes, sir, muttered West. He fumbled the door shut behind him with numb fingers, walked slowly down the hallway, staring at the floor. War. War in the north. Dunbrek fallen, the Northmen loose in Angland. Officers hurried around him. Someone brushed past, but he hardly noticed. There were people in danger, mortal danger. People he knew, maybe, neighbors from home. There was fighting even now inside the Union's borders. He rubbed his jaw. This war could be a terrible thing, worse than Gurkel had been even, and he would be at the heart of it. A place on a Lord Marshal's staff. Him, Column West, a commoner? He still could hardly believe it. West felt a sneaking, guilty glow of satisfaction. It was for just such an appointment that he had been working like a dog all these years. If he did well, there was no telling where he might go. This war was a bad thing, a terrible thing, no doubt. He felt himself grinning. A terrible thing. But it just might be the making of him. Chapter 23. The Theatrical Outfitters. The deck creaked and shifted beneath his feet, the sailcloth flapped gently, seabirds crowed and called in the salty air above. "I never thought to see such a thing," muttered Logan. The city was a huge white crescent stretching all round the wide blue bay, sprawling across many bridges, tiny in the distance, and onto rocky islands in the sea. Here and there, green parks stood out from the confusion of buildings. The thin grey lines of rivers and canals shone in the sun. There were walls, too, studded with towers skirting the distant edge of the city and striking boldly through the jumble of houses. Logan's jaw hung stupidly open. His eyes darted here and there, unable to take in the whole. "Adua," murmured Baez. "The center of the world. The poets call her the City of White Towers. Beautiful, isn't she, from a distance?" The Magus leaned towards him. "Believe me, though, she stinks when you get close." A vast fortress rose up from within the city, its sheer white walls towering above the carpet of buildings outside, bright sunlight glinting on shining domes within. Logan had never dreamed of a man-made thing so great, so proud, so strong. One tower in particular rose high, high over all the others, a tapering cluster of smooth, dark pillars seeming to support the very sky. "And Bethod means to make war on this?" he whispered. "He must be mad." "Perhaps. Bethod, for all his waste and pride, understands the Union." Baez nodded towards the city. "They are jealous of one another, all those people. It may be a union in name, but they fight each other tooth and nail. The lowly squabble over trifles, the great wage secret wars for power and wealth, and they call it government. Wars of words and tricks and guile, but no less bloody for that. The casualties are many." The Magus sighed. "Behind those walls they shout and argue and endlessly bite one another's backs. Old squabbles are never settled, but thrive and put down roots, and the roots grow deeper with the passing years. It has always been so. They are not like you, Logan. A man here can smile and fawn and call you friend, give you gifts with one hand and stab you with the other. You will find this a strange place." Logan already found it the strangest thing he had ever seen. There was no end to it. As their boat slipped into the bay, the city seemed to grow more vast than ever. A forest of white buildings, speckled with dark windows, embracing them on all sides, covering the hills in roofs and towers, crowding together, wall squashed to wall, pressing up against the water on the shoreline. Ships and boats of all designs vied with each other in the bay, sails billowing, crewmen crying out over the noise of the spray, hurrying about the decks and crawling through the rigging. Some were smaller even than their own little two-sailed boat. Some were far larger. Logan gawped, amazed, as a huge vessel ploughed through the water towards them, shining spray flying from its prow. a mountain of wood floating by some magic in the sea. The ship passed, leaving them rocking in its wake, but there were more, many more, tethered to the countless wharves along the shore. Logan, shielding his eyes against the bright sun with one hand, began to make out people on the sprawling docks. He began to hear them, too, a faint din of voices crying and carts rattling and cargoes clattering to the ground. There were hundreds of tiny figures swarming among the ships and buildings like black ants. "How many live here?" he whispered. "Thousands," Baez shrugged. "Hundreds of thousands. People from every land within the circle of the world. There are Northmen here and dark-skinned Cantics from Gurkle and beyond. People from the old empire, far to the west, and merchants of the free cities of Styria. Others, too, from still further away, the Thousand Islands, distant Suljuk, and Thond, where they worship the sun. More people than can be counted, living, dying, working, breeding, climbing one upon the other. Welcome," and Baez spread his arms wide to encompass the monstrous, the beautiful, the endless city, "to civilization." Hundreds of thousands. Logan struggled to understand it. Hundreds of thousands. Could there be so many people in the world? He stared at the city all around him, wondering, rubbing his aching eyes. What might 100,000 people look like? An hour later, he knew. Only in battle had Logan ever been so squashed, hemmed, pressed by other people. It was like a battle, here on the docks. The cries, the anger, the crush, the fear and confusion. A battle in which no mercy was shown, and which had no end and no winners. Logan was used to the open sky, the air around him, his own company. On the road, when Baez and Quai had ridden close beside him, he'd felt squeezed. Now there were people on every side, pushing, jostling, shouting, hundreds of them, thousands, hundreds of thousands. Could they really all be people? People like him, with thoughts and moods and dreams? Faces loomed up and flashed by, surly, anxious, frowning, gone in a sickening whirl of colour. Logan swallowed, blinked. His throat was painfully dry. His head span. Surely this was hell. He knew he deserved to be here, but he didn't remember dying. "Malachus!" he hissed desperately. The apprentice looked round. "Stop a moment!" Logan pulled at his collar, trying to let some air in. "I can't breathe." Quai grinned. "It might just be the smell." It might at that. The docks smelled like hell and no mistake. The reek of stinking fish, sickly spices, rotting fruit, fresh dung, sweating horses and mules and people mingled and bred under the hot sun and became worse by far than any one alone. "Move!" A shoulder knocked Logan roughly aside and was gone. He leaned against a grimy wall and wiped sweat from his face. Baez was smiling. "Not like the wide and barren north, eh, Nine Fingers?" "No." Logan watched the people milling past, the horses, the carts, the endless faces. A man stared suspiciously at him as he passed. A boy pointed at him and shouted something. A woman with a basket gave him a wide berth, staring fearfully up as she hurried by. Now he had a moment to think. They were all looking and pointing and staring, and they didn't look happy. Logan leaned down to Malachus. "I am feared and hated throughout the north. I don't like it, but I know why." A sullen group of sailors stared at him with hard eyes, muttering to each other under their breath. He watched them, puzzled, until they disappeared behind a rumbling wagon. "Why do they hate me here?" "Bethod has moved quickly," muttered Baez, frowning out at the crowds. His war with the Union has already begun. We will not find the North too popular in Adua, I fear." "How do they know where I'm from?" Malicus raised an eyebrow. "You stick out somewhat." Logan flinched as a pair of laughing youths flashed by him. "I do? Among all this?" "Only like a huge, scarred, dirty gatepost." "Ah." He looked down at himself.
Step on up.
"I see."
Safe travels.
Away from the docks, the crowds grew sparser, the air cleaner, the noise faded. It was still teeming, stinking, and noisy, but at least Logan could take a breath. They passed across wide paved squares, decorated with plants and statues, where brightly painted wooden signs hung over doors. Blue fish, pink pigs, purple bunches of grapes, brown loaves of bread. There were tables and chairs out in the sun where people sat and ate from flat pots, drank from green glass cups. They threaded through narrow alleys where rickety-looking wood and plaster buildings leaned out over them, almost meeting above their heads, leaving only a thin strip of blue sky between. They wandered down wide cobbled roads, busy with people and lined with monstrous white buildings. Logan blinked and gaped at all of it. On no moor, however foggy, in no forest, however dense, had Logan ever felt so completely lost. He had no idea now in what direction the boat was, though they'd left it no more than half an hour ago. The sun was hidden behind the towering buildings, and everything looked the same. He was terrified he'd lose track of Baez and Quai in the crowds and be lost forever. He hurried after the back of the wizard's bald head, following him into an open space. A great road, bigger than any they'd seen so far, bounded on either side by white palaces behind high walls and fences lined with ancient trees. The people here were different. Their clothes were bright and gaudy, cut in strange styles that served no purpose. The women hardly seemed like people at all, pale and bony, swaddled in shining fabric, flapping at themselves in the hot sun with pieces of cloth stretched over sticks. "Where are we?" he shouted at Baez. If the wizard had answered that they were on the moon, Logan would not have been surprised. "This is the Middle Way, one of the city's main thoroughfares. It cuts through the very center of the city to the Agriont." Agriont? Fortress, palace, barracks, seat of government. A city within the city, the heart of the Union. That's where we're going. "We are?" A group of sour young men stared suspiciously at Logan as he passed them. "Will they let us in?" "Oh, yes, but they won't like it." Logan struggled on through the crowds. Everywhere the sun twinkled on the panes of glass windows, hundreds of them. Carleon had a few glass windows in the grandest buildings, at least before they'd sacked the city. Precious few afterwards, it had to be admitted. Precious little of anything. The dogman had loved the sound the glass made as it broke. He'd prodded at the windows with a spear, a great big smile on his face, delighted by the crash and tinkle. That had hardly been the worst of it. Bethod had given the city to his carls for 3 days. That was his custom, and they loved him for it. Logan had lost his finger in the battle the day before, and they'd closed the wound with hot iron. It throbbed, and the pain had made him savage, as though he'd needed an excuse for violence back then. He remembered the stink of blood and sweat and smoke, the sounds of screaming and crashing and laughter. "Please." Logan tripped, nearly fell. There was something clinging to his leg. A woman sitting on the ground beside a wall. Her clothes were dirty, ragged. Her face was pale, pinched with hunger. She had something in her arms, a bundle of rags, a child. "Please." Nothing else. The people laughed and chattered and surged around them, just as if they weren't there. "Please." "I don't have anything," he muttered. No more than 5 strides away, a man in a tall hat sat at a table and chuckled with a friend as he tucked into a steaming plate of meat and vegetables. Logan blinked at the plate of food, at the starving woman. "Logan, come on!" Bias had taken him by the elbow and was drawing him away. "But shouldn't we? Haven't you noticed? They're everywhere. The king needs money, so he squeezes the nobles. The nobles squeeze their tenants, the tenants squeeze the peasants. Some of them, the old, the weak, the extra sons and daughters, they get squeezed right out the bottom. Too many mouths to feed. The lucky ones make thieves or whores, the rest end up begging. But clear the road!" Logan stumbled to the wall and pressed himself against it, Malachus and Bias beside him. The crowds parted, and a long column of men tramped by, shepherded by armoured guards. Some were young, mere boys. Some were very old. All were dirty and ragged, and few of them looked healthy. A couple were clearly lame, hobbling along as best they could. One near the front had only one arm. A passer-by in a fabulous crimson jacket held a square of cloth over his wrinkled nose as the beggars shuffled past. "What are these?" Logan whispered to Bias. "Lawbreakers?" The Magus chuckled. "Soldiers." Logan stared at them, filthy, coughing, limping, some without boots. "Soldiers? These?" "Oh, yes. They go to fight Bethod." Logan rubbed at his temples. "A clan once sent their poorest warrior, a man called Forley the Weakest, to fight me in a duel. They meant it by way of surrender. Why does this union send their weakest?" Logan shook his head grimly. "They won't beat Bethod with such as these." "They will send others." Bias pointed out another, smaller gathering. "Those are soldiers, too." "Those?" A group of tall youths dressed in gaudy suits of red or bright green cloth, a couple with outsize hats. They were at least wearing swords, of a kind, but they hardly looked like fighting men. Fighting women, maybe. Logan frowned, staring from one group to the other. The dirty beggars, the gaudy lads. It was hard for him to say which were the stranger. A tiny bell jingled as the door opened, and Logan followed Bias through the low archway, Malachus behind him. The shop was dim after the bright street, and it took Logan's eyes a moment to adjust. Leaning against a wall were sheets of wood, childishly daubed with pictures of buildings, forests, mountains. Strange clothes were draped over stands beside them, flowing robes, lurid gowns, suits of armour, enormous hats and helmets, rings and jewellery, even a heavy crown. Weapons occupied a small rack, swords and spears richly decorated. Logan stepped closer, frowning. They were fakes. Nothing was real. The weapons were painted wood. The crown was made of flaking tin. The jewels were coloured glass. What is this place? Bias was casting an eye over the robes by the wall. A theatrical outfitters. A what? The people of this city love spectacle, comedy, drama, theatre of all kinds. This shop provides equipment for the mounting of plays. Stories. Logan poked at a wooden sword. Some people have too much time on their hands. A small, plump man emerged from a door at the back of the shop, looking Bias, Malachus, and Logan over suspiciously. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Of course." Bias stepped forward, switching effortlessly to the common tongue. "We are mounting a production and require some costumes. We understand you are the foremost theatrical outfitters in all of Adua." The shopkeepers smiled nervously, taking in their grimy faces and travel-stained clothes. True, but quality is expensive, gentlemen." "Money is no object." Bias took out a bulging purse and tossed it absently on the counter. It sagged open, heavy golden coins scattering across the wood. The shopkeeper's eyes lit with an inner fire. "Of course! What precisely did you have in mind?" "I need a magnificent robe suitable for a magus or a great sorcerer or some such. Something of the arcane about it, certainly. Then we'll have something similar, if less impressive, for an apprentice. Finally, we need something for a mighty warrior, a prince of the distant north. Something with fur, I imagine." "Those should be straightforward. I will see what we have." The shopkeeper disappeared through the door behind the counter. "What is all this shit?" asked Logan. The wizard grinned. "People are born to their station here. They have commoners to fight and farm the land and do the work. They have gentry to trade and build and do the thinking. They have nobility to own the land and push the others around. They have royalty." Bias glanced at the tin crown. "I forget exactly why. In the north, you can rise as high as your merits will take you. Only look at our mutual friend Bethod. Not so here. A man is born in his place and is expected to stay there. We must seem to be from a high place indeed if we are to be taken seriously. Dressed as we are, we wouldn't get past the gates of the Agriont." The shopkeeper interrupted him by reappearing through the door, his arms heaped with bright cloth. "One mystical robe suitable for the most powerful of wizards. Used last year for adjuvants in a production of The End of the Empire during the Spring Festival. It is, if I may say so, some of my best work." Bias held the shimmering swathe of crimson cloth up to the faint light, gazing at it admiringly. Arcane diagrams, mystical lettering, and symbols of sun, moon, and stars glittered in silver thread. Malachus ran a hand over the shining cloth of his own absurd garment. "I don't think you'd have laughed me off so quickly, eh, Logan, if I'd arrived at your campfire dressed in this?"
Yeah.
Logan winced. "I reckon I might have." "And here we have a splendid piece of barbarian garb." The shopkeeper hefted a black leather tunic onto the counter, set with swirls of shiny brass, trimmed with pointless tissues of delicate chainmail. He pointed at the matching fur cloak. "This is real sable." It was a ludicrous piece of clothing, equally useless for warmth or protection. Logan folded his arms across his old coat. "You think I'm going to wear that?" The shopkeeper swallowed nervously. "You must forgive my friend," said Bias. "He is an actor after the new fashion. He believes in losing himself entirely in his role." "Is that so?" squeaked the man, looking Logan up and down. "Northmen are, I suppose, topical?" "Absolutely. I do declare Master Ninefingers is the very best at what he does." The old wizard nudged Logan in the ribs. "The very best. I have seen it." "If you say so." The shopkeeper looked far from convinced. "Might I inquire what you will be staging?" "Oh, it's a new piece." Bias tapped the side of his bald head with a finger. "I am still working on the details." "Really?" "Indeed. More a scene than an entire play." He glanced back at the robe, admiring the way the light glittered on the arcane symbols. "A scene in which Bias, the first of the Magi, finally takes up his seat on the closed council." "Ah!" The shopkeeper nodded knowingly. "A political piece, a biting satire, perhaps? Will it be comic or dramatic in tone?" Bias glanced sidelong at Logan. "That remains to be seen."
Safe travels.
Chapter 24. Barbarians at the Gate. Giselle flashed along the lane beside the moat, feet pounding on the worn cobblestones, the great white wall sliding endlessly by on his right. one tower after another, as he made his daily circuit of the Agriont. Since he had cut down on the drinking, the improvement in his stamina had been impressive. He was scarcely even out of breath. It was early, and the streets of the city were nearly empty. The odd person would look up at him as he ran by, maybe even call out some word of encouragement, but Giselle barely noticed them. His eyes were fixed on the sparkling, lapping water in the moat, and his mind was elsewhere. Adi. Where else was it ever? He had supposed, after that day when West had warned him off, after he had stopped seeing her, that his thoughts would soon return to other matters, and other women. He had applied himself to his fencing with a will, attempted to show an interest in his duties as an officer, but he found himself unable to concentrate, and other women seemed now pale, flat, tedious creatures. The long runs, the monotonous exercises with bar and beam, gave his mind ample opportunity to wander. The tedium of peacetime soldiering was even worse, reading boring papers, standing guard on things that needed no guarding. His attention would inevitably slip, and then she would be there. Adi in wholesome peasant garb, flushed and sweaty from hard work in the fields. Adi in the finery of a princess, glittering with jewels. Adi bathing in forest pools while he watched from the bushes. Adi proper and demure, glancing shyly up at him from beneath her lashes. Adi a whore by the docks, beckoning to him from a grimy doorway. The fantasies were infinite in variety, but they all ended the same way. His hour-long circuit of the Agriont was complete, and he thumped across the bridge and back in through the south gate. Giselle treated the guards to their daily share of indifference, trotted through the tunnel and up the long ramp into the fortress, then turned towards the courtyard, where Marshal Varuz would be waiting. All the while, Adi was rubbing up against the back of his mind. It was hardly as though he had nothing else to think about. The contest was close now, very close. Soon he would fight before the cheering crowds, his family and friends among them. It might make his reputation, or sink it. He should have been lying awake at night, tense and sweating, worrying endlessly about forms and training and steals. And yet, somehow, that wasn't what he thought about in bed. Then there was a war on. It was easy to forget, here in the sunny lanes of the Agriont, that Angland had been invaded by hordes of slavering barbarians. He would be going north soon to lead his company in battle. There, surely, was a thought to keep a man occupied. Was not war a deadly business? He could be hurt or scarred or killed even. Giselle tried to conjure up the twisting, twitching, painted face of Fenris the Feared. Legions of screaming savages descending upon the Agriont. It was a terrible business, all right, a dangerous and frightening business. Adi came from Angland. What if, say, she were to fall into the hands of the Northmen? Giselle would rush to her rescue, of course. She would not be hurt. Well, not badly. Perhaps her clothes a little torn, like so. No doubt she would be frightened, grateful. He would be obliged to comfort her, of course. She might even faint. He might have to carry her, her head pressed against his shoulder. He might have to lay her down and loosen her clothes. Their lips might touch, just brush gently. Hers might part a little. Then Giselle stumbled in the road. There was a pleasant swelling building in his crotch. Pleasant, but hardly compatible with a brisk run. He was nearly at the courtyard now, and this would never do at fencing practice. He glanced desperately around for a distraction, and nearly choked on his tongue. Major West was standing by the wall, dressed to fence, and watching him approach with an unusually grim expression. For an instant, Giselle wondered if his friend might be able to tell what he'd been thinking. He swallowed guiltily, felt the blood rushing to his face. West couldn't know. He couldn't. But he was most unhappy about something. "Lothar," he grunted. "West, Giselle stared down at his shoes. They had not been getting on too well since West joined Lord Marshal Burr's staff. Giselle tried to be happy for him, but could not escape the feeling that he was better qualified for the post. He had excellent blood, after all, whether he had experience in the field or not. Then Adi was still lurking between them, that unpleasant and needless warning. Everyone knew that West had been first through the breach at Ulriok. Everyone knew that he had the devil of a temper. That had always seemed exciting to Giselle, until he got on the wrong end of it. "Baruz is waiting." West unfolded his arms and strode off towards the archway. "And he's not alone." "Not alone?" "The Marshal feels you need to get used to an audience." Giselle frowned. "I'm surprised anyone cares in the present climate, what with the war and all." "You'd be surprised. Fighting and fencing and all things martial are very much the flavour. Everyone's wearing a sword these days, even if they've never drawn one in their lives. There's an absolute fever about the contest, believe me." Giselle blinked as they passed into the bright courtyard. A stand of temporary seating had been hastily erected along one wall, packed from one end to the other with people, 80 or more.
"And here he is!"
shouted Marshal Varuz. There was a ripple of polite applause. Giselle felt himself grinning. There were some very important people in amongst the crowd. He spotted Morovia, the Lord High Justice, stroking his long beard. Lord Isha was not far away from him, looking slightly bored. Crown Prince Ladislas himself was lounging on the front row, shining in a shirt of gossamer chainmail and clapping enthusiastically. The people on the benches behind had to lean over to see round the waving plume on his magnificent hat. Varuz handed Giselle his steels, still beaming. "Don't you dare make me look like a fool," he hissed. Giselle coughed nervously, looking up at the rows of expectant people. His heart sank. Inquisitor Glockter's toothless grin leered at him from the crowd, and on the row behind him, Adi West. She was wearing an expression that she never had in his daydreams, 1/3 sullen, 1/3 accusing, 1/3 simply bored. He glanced away, staring toward the opposite wall, inwardly cursing his own cowardice. He seemed unable to meet anyone's eye these days.
"This bout will be fought with half-edged steels," thundered the Lord Marshal. "The best of 3 touches."
West already had his swords drawn and was making his way to the circle, marked out with white chalk in the carefully shaved grass. Giselle's heart was hammering loud as he fumbled his own steels out of their sheaths, acutely aware of all those eyes upon him. He took his mark opposite West, pushing his feet cautiously into the grass. West raised his steels, Giselle did the same. They faced each other for a moment, motionless.
"Begin!"
shouted Varuz. It quickly became clear that West had no mind to roll over for him. He came on with more than his usual ferocity, harrying Giselle with a flurry of heavy cuts, their steels clashing and scraping rapidly together. He gave ground, still uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of all those people, damned important people, some of them. But as West pushed him back towards the edge of the circle, his nerves began to fade. His training took over. He ducked away, making room for himself, parrying the cuts with left and right, dodging and dancing, too fast to catch. The people faded. Even Adi was gone. The blades moved by themselves, back and forth, up and down. There was no need for him to look at them. He turned his attention to West's eyes, watched them flicker from the ground to the steels, to Giselle's dancing feet, trying to guess his intentions. He felt the lunge coming even before it was begun. He feinted one way, then turned the other, slipping smoothly round behind West as he blundered past. It was a simple matter for him to apply his foot to the seat of his opponent's trousers and shove him out of the circle.
"A touch!"
shouted Marshal Varuz. There was a ripple of laughter as the Major sprawled on his face.
A touch on the arse! Guffawed the Crown Prince, his plume waving back and forth with merriment. One to Captain Luther! West didn't look half so intimidating with his face in the dirt. Giselle gave a little bow to the audience, risked a smile in Ardy's direction as he rose. He was disappointed to see she wasn't even looking at him. She was watching her brother struggle in the dust with a faint, cruel grin. West got slowly to his feet. "A good touch," he muttered through gritted teeth as he stepped back into the circle. Giselle took his own mark, barely able to suppress his smile. "Begin!" shouted Varuz. West came on strongly again, but Giselle was warming to his task now. The sounds of the audience muttered and swelled as he danced this way and that. He began to work the odd flourish into his movements, and the onlookers responded, oohs and ahs, floating up as he flicked West's efforts away. He had never fenced so well, never moved so smoothly. The bigger man was starting to tire a little. The snap was going out of his cuts. Their long steels clashed together, scraped. Giselle twisted his right wrist and tore West's blade from his fingers, stepped in and slashed at him with his left. "Gah!" West winced and dropped his short steel, hopping away and grabbing his forearm. A few drops of blood pattered across the ground. "Two to nothing!" shouted Varuz. The Crown Prince jumped up, his hat tumbling off, delighted by the sight of blood. "Excellent!" he squawked. "Capital!" Others joined him on their feet, clapping loudly. Giselle basked in their approval, smiling wide, every muscle tingling with happiness. He understood now what he had been training for. "Well fought, Giselle," muttered West, a trickle of blood running down his forearm. "You've got too good for me. Sorry about the cut." Giselle grinned. He wasn't sorry in the least. "It's nothing, just a scratch." West strode away, frowning and holding his wrist. Nobody paid much attention to his exit, Giselle least of all. Sporting events are all about the winners. Lord Morovia was the first to get up from the benches and offer his congratulations. "What a promising young man," he said, smiling warmly at Giselle. "But do you think he can beat Bremadan Ghost?" Varuz gave Giselle a fatherly clap on the shoulder. "I'm sure he can beat anyone on the right day." Have you seen Ghost fence?" "No, though I hear he is most impressive." "Oh, indeed. He is a devil." The High Justice raised his bushy eyebrows. "I look forward to seeing them meet. Have you ever considered a career in the law, Captain Luther?" Giselle was taken by surprise. No, your worship. That is, I am a soldier." "Of course you are. But battles and so forth can play hell with the nerves. If you should ever change your mind, perhaps I might have a place for you. I can always find a use for promising men." Thank you. Until the contest, then. Good luck, Captain," he threw over his shoulder as he shuffled away. The implication was that he thought Giselle would need a great deal of it. His Highness Prince Ladislas was more optimistic. "You're my man, Luther," he shouted, poking the air with his fingers as though they were fencing steels. "I'm going to double my bet on you." Giselle bowed obsequiously. "Your Highness is too kind." "You're my man, a soldier. A fencing man should fight for his country, Varuz. Why isn't this Ghost a soldier?" "I believe he is, your Highness," said the Lord Marshal gently. "He is a kinsman of Lord Brock and serves with his personal guard." "Oh." The prince seemed confused for a moment, but soon perked up. "But you're my man!" he shouted at Giselle, poking once more with his fingers, the feather on his hat waving this way and that. "You're the man for me!" He danced off towards the archway, decorative chainmail gleaming. "Very impressive." Giselle whipped round, took an ungainly step back, clocked her,
leering at him from his blind side. For a cripple, he had an uncanny knack of sneaking up on a man. "What a happy chance for everyone that you didn't give it up after all." "I never had any intention of doing so," snapped Giselle frostily. Glockter sucked at his gums. "If you say so, Captain." "I do." Giselle turned rudely away, hoping that he never had occasion to speak to the loathsome man again. He found himself staring straight into Ardy's face, no more than a foot away. "Yeah," he stammered, stepping back again. "Giselle," she said, "I haven't seen you in a while." He glanced nervously around. Glockter was shambling away. West was long gone. Baruz was busy holding forth to Lord Isher and a few others still remaining in the courtyard. They were unobserved. He had to speak to her. He ought to tell her straight out that he could not see her any more. He owed her that much. Nothing to say to me." He turned swiftly on his heel and walked away, his shoulders prickling with shame. The tedium of guard duty at the south gate seemed, after all that unexpected excitement, almost a mercy. Giselle was quite looking forward to standing idly by, watching people file in and out of the Agriont, listening to Lieutenant Casper's mindless babble. At least, he was, until he got there. Casper and the usual complement of armoured soldiers were clustered around the outer gates, where the old bridge across the moat passed between the two massive, white-rendered towers of the gatehouse. As Giselle marched down to the end of the long tunnel, he saw that there was someone with them. A small, harassed-looking fellow wearing spectacles. Giselle recognized him vaguely. Morrow, he was called, some crony of the Lord Chamberlain. He had no reason to be here.
"Captain Luthar, what a happy chance!"
Giselle jumped. It was that lunatic Sulphur, sitting cross-legged on the ground behind him, his back against the sheer wall of the gatehouse. "What the hell's he doing here?" snapped Giselle. Casper opened his mouth to speak, but Sulphur got in first.
"Don't mind me, Captain. I'm simply waiting for my master."
"Your master?" He dreaded to think what manner of an idiot this idiot might serve.
"Indeed. He should be here very shortly."
Sulphur frowned up at the sun.
"He is already somewhat tardy, if the truth be told."
"Really?"
"Yes."
The madman broke into a friendly smile once more.
"But he'll be along, Giselle. You can depend on it."
First-name terms was too much to take. He hardly knew the man, and what he knew he didn't like. He opened his mouth to give him a piece of his mind, but Sulphur suddenly jumped up, grabbing his stick from the wall and brushing himself down.
"Here they are,"
he said, looking out across the moat. Giselle followed the idiot's eyes with his own. A magnificent old man was striding purposefully across the bridge, bald head held high, a fabulous gown of shimmering red and silver flowing about him in the breeze. At his heels came a sickly-looking youth, head a little bowed, as if in awe of the older man, holding a long staff out before him in upturned palms. A great brute of a man in a heavy fur cloak followed behind them, a good half-head taller than the other two. "What the—" Giselle trailed off. He seemed to recognize the old man from somewhere. Some lord, perhaps, from the open council? Some foreign ambassador? Certainly he had an air of majesty. Giselle racked his brains as they approached, but could not place him. The old man stopped before the gatehouse, swept Giselle, Casper, Morrow, and the guards imperiously with glittering green eyes. "Yoru," he said. Sulphur stepped forward, bowing low.
"Master Bias,"
he murmured in hushed tones of deep respect. And that was it. That was why Giselle knew the man. He bore a definite resemblance to the statue of Bias in the Kingsway. The statue Giselle had run past so many times. A little fatter, perhaps, but that expression, stern, wise, effortlessly commanding, was just the same. Giselle frowned. For the old man to be called by that name? He didn't like it. He didn't like the look of the lanky young man with the staff either. He liked the look of the old man's other companion even less. West had often told Giselle that the Northmen found in Adua, usually skulking dishevelled by the docks or dirty drunk in gutters, were by no means typical of their people. Those that lived free in the far north, fighting, feuding, feasting, and doing whatever Northmen did, were of quite a different kind. A tall, fierce, handsome people, Giselle had always imagined, with a touch of romance about them. Strong, yet graceful. Wild, yet noble. Savage, yet cunning. The kind of men whose eyes are fixed always on the far horizon. This was not one of those. Never in his life had Giselle seen a more brutish-looking man. Even Fenris the Feared had seemed civilized by comparison. His face was like a whipped back, crisscrossed with ragged scars. His nose was bent, pointing off a little sideways. One ear had a big notch out of it. One eye seemed a touch higher than the other, surrounded by a crescent-shaped wound. His whole face, in fact, was slightly beaten, broken, lopsided, like that of a prize fighter who has fought a few bouts too many. His expression, too, was that of one punch-drunk. He gawped up at the gatehouse, forehead furrowed, mouth hanging open, staring about him with a look of near-animal stupidity. He wore a long fur cloak and a leather tunic set with gold, but this height of barbaric splendour only made him look more savage, and there was no missing the long, heavy sword at his belt. The Northman scratched at a big pink scar through the stubble on his cheek as he peered up at the sheer walls above, and Giselle noticed one of his fingers was missing, as though any further evidence of a life of violence and savagery was necessary. To let this hulking primitive into the Agriont, while they were at war with the Northmen, it was unthinkable, but Morrow was already sidling forward.
"The Lord Chamberlain is expecting you, gentlemen,"
he gushed as he bowed and scraped his way towards the old man.
"If you would care to follow me."
"One moment." Giselle grabbed the Under-Secretary by the elbow and pulled him aside. "Him too?" he asked incredulously, nodding over at the primitive in the cloak. "We are at war, you know."
"Lord Hoff was most specific."
Morrow shook his arm free, spectacles flashing.
"Keep him here if you wish, but you can explain it to the Lord Chamberlain."
Giselle swallowed. That idea was not at all appealing. He glanced up at the old man, but could not look him in the eye for long. He had a mysterious air, an air of knowing something no one else could guess, and it was most unsettling. "You must leave your weapons here," he shouted, speaking as slowly and clearly as possible. "Happy to." The Northman pulled the sword from his belt and held it out. It weighed heavily in Giselle's hands, a big, plain, brutal-looking weapon. He followed it with a long knife, then knelt and pulled another from his boot. He took a third from the small of his back, and then produced a thin blade from inside his sleeve, heaping them into Giselle's outstretched arms. The Northman smiled broadly. It was truly a hideous sight, the ragged scars twisting and puckering, making his face more lopsided than ever. "You can never have too many knives," he growled in a deep, grinding voice. Nobody laughed, but he did not seem to care.
"Shall we go?"
asked the old man.
"Without delay,"
said Morrow, turning to leave. "I'll come with you." Giselle dumped his armload of weapons into Caspar's hands.
"That really isn't necessary, Captain,"
whined Morrow. "I insist." Once he was delivered to the Lord Chamberlain, the Northman could murder whomever he pleased. It would be someone else's problem. But until he got there, Giselle might be blamed for whatever mischief he got up to, and he was damned if he was going to let that happen. The guards stood aside. The strange procession passed through the gate. Morrow was first, whispering obsequious nothings over his shoulder to the old man in the splendid robe. The pale youth was next, followed by Sulphur. The nine-fingered Northman lumbered along at the back. Giselle followed with his thumb in his belt, close to the hilt of his sword so he could get to it quickly, watching the savage intently for any sudden moves. After following him for a short while, though, Giselle had to admit the man gave no appearance of having murder in mind. If anything, he looked curious, amused, and somewhat embarrassed. He kept slowing, staring up at the buildings around him, shaking his head, scratching his face, muttering under his breath. He would occasionally horrify passers-by by smiling at them, but he seemed to present no greater threat, and Giselle began to relax, at least until they reached the square of marshals. The Northman stopped suddenly. Giselle fumbled for his sword, but the primitive's eyes were locked ahead, gazing at a fountain nearby. He moved slowly towards it, then cautiously raised a thick finger and poked at the glittering jet. Water splashed into his face, and he blundered away, almost knocking Giselle down. "A spring," he whispered. "But how?" Mercy, the man was like a child, a 6.5-foot child with a face like a butcher's block. "There are pipes," Giselle stamped on the paving, "beneath the ground." "Pipes," echoed the primitive quietly, staring at the frothing water. The others had moved some way ahead, close to the grand building in which Hoff had his offices. Giselle began to step away from the fountain, hoping to draw the witless savage with him. To Giselle's relief, he followed, shaking his head and muttering "pipes" to himself over and over. They entered the cool darkness of the Lord Chamberlain's anteroom. There were people seated on the benches around the walls, some of them giving the impression of having been waiting a very long time. They all stared as Morrow ushered the peculiar group straight into Hoff's offices. The spectacled secretary opened the heavy double doors and stood by, while first the old bald man, then his crony with the stick, then the madman Sulphur, and finally the nine-fingered primitive walked in past him. Giselle made to follow them, but Morrow stood in the doorway and blocked his path. "Thank you so much for your help, Captain," he said with a thin smile. "You may return to the gate." Giselle peered over his shoulder into the room beyond. He saw the Lord Chamberlain frowning behind a long table. Arch-Lector Salt was beside him, grim and suspicious. High Justice Morovia was there too, a smile on his wrinkled face. 3 members of the closed council. Then Morrow shut the door in his face.